Nearing the climax of Avengers Endgame, various portals open up around the core members, and an army of heroes joins them against Thanos' troops. The camera closes in on Captain America as he says, "Avengers, assemble." Many an audience cheered in the theaters at that moment. It was the culmination of 10 years of stories. Yet it was also built upon decades of comics, where that line had been given by old Steve himself many times. It was a moment that audiences had anticipated for so long. Something we knew was coming. A line that had even been said before. But with the army of superheroes around him, it encapsulated much of who the character was. Thus, when we saw Captain America say that line, we couldn't help but cheer with excitement. Finally! That same sense of cheer for a person to step up in the moment as the leader that we've known them to be all along, that same sense is found in our passage for this sermon, in 1 Samuel chapter 30. We've known for nearly half of 1 Samuel that David will rise to be the king of Israel. I mean, his anointing was in chapter 16. And in terms of history, it's been just over a couple of decades between that event and the place where we find David in chapter 30. A ton has happened. David slew Goliath, befriended Jonathan, became Saul's armor-bearer and court bard. He led armies against the Philistines, became the object of Saul's ire, spent years on the run in the Judean wilderness. And recently he spent nearly 2 years among the Philistines in Gath, even gaining possession of the city of Ziklag for it. It's been so long that we're starting to ask if David will ever actually be king of Israel. But there are a couple of things that we know which will answer that question. In chapter 28, we saw the prophecy of Saul's upcoming defeat. And in the last sermon, we saw God protect his chosen king from having to fight his own people. The king and commanders of the Philistines themselves served as the ironic saviors for David as they sent him back to Ziklag, while they continued to go on to fight Saul and the Israelite army. It seems that David will finally be able to take the throne once Saul has died. But it's not the throne that makes a king. It takes kingly actions. And here in chapter 30, we will witness David continue in the godly actions which also lead him to the kingly actions. The first of these actions that we see is the exact opposite of what Saul had been doing for such a long time. A godly leader will seek God's will in the sorrowful times, instead of saving face in front of the crowds. 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 1 to 8. Now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the 3rd day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negev and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's 2 wives had also been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his own sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God, and David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them?" He answered him, "Pursue, for you shall surely overtake, and shall surely rescue." In the first 2 of those verses, the author gives the audience some sense of the background of the scene. The first piece of this background is that David and his men had spent the last 3 days en route from the last chapter's Philistine army gathering. So basically, they've been on march for 6 straight days. 3 days on the 50 to 60 mile journey with the Philistines, and 3 days back. And they are ready to be home. It's the last leg of a journey that felt rather harrowing for the first half. They're on cooldown, and about to be done. Also, as a side note, keep that time frame of 3 days in mind for a little later in the story. The second piece of background in those 2 verses is that the Amalekites, who'd been raiding much of the southern lands of Judah, had ransacked and burned Ziklag to the ground. Remember, again, the Amalekites were the people whom Saul should have utterly destroyed, but didn't. The less than godly action of a king that led to his rejection. While the Philistines are the epitome of human evil in the book of Samuel, the Amalekites are the symbol of Saul's failure as a king. And while David had been doing quite the job of taking on the Amalekites while he had been among the Philistines, they had yet to be utterly destroyed. And since David had left Ziklag basically undefended, the Amalekites decided to get a little vengeance on David and his men. They raided everything and burned the city to the ground, leaving David and his men with nothing. Which leads us to the third and final piece of background information from those first 2 verses. The Amalekites didn't kill any of the people of Ziklag. No, they herded the people like cattle. Now we have to ask why the Amalekites would do such a thing. Wouldn't it just be easier for them to slay everybody and just take the stuff? Yeah, it would have. But there are 2 reasons why they didn't kill any of them. One is that it was God's protective will, his desire to safeguard the families of the men surrounding his chosen king. But the second reason is the more human reason. In that day and age, when groups of fighters took human captives, it was more than likely that they would sell the people as slaves, a type of double dipping into the looting of the city. They not only gained all the victims' wealth and possessions, but also the money that human slaves could earn. It was not a pleasant situation for the captives, to be sure. But as we move out of the first 2 verses of this chapter, we have to realize that none of this information is known by David's men as they neared their homes. No, they were likely feeling pumped at almost being home, celebrating God's grace and provision that let them not have to fight their own people. I'm sure that they were all smiles and laughter, until they saw the smoke rising in the distance, from the direction of Ziklag. Smiles turned to concerned glances and questioning faces. The last leg became a mad dash. The entire city had been burned, nothing but ash and cinders, and no bodies could be found. The troops couldn't even be certain who did this. It's not like they had camera feeds telling them who demolished their livelihoods. These men, who had just escaped one fire, now found themselves among ashes. And dropping to their knees as one, the men wept and wailed for their lost families. They mourned until their tears ran out. They had literally lost everything. And this includes David, who had lost both of the wives he'd left in the city. But then the tears turned to anger. Statements of, if only we hadn't gone marching with the Philistines. If only we hadn't come to this God-forsaken land of our enemies. If only David had assassinated Saul when he had had the chance. If only we had never followed David to begin with. Their fury led them to begin the task of finding someone to blame, someone whom they actually could take vengeance on. And their eyes fell upon their leader, and some began to pick up stones. This is all your fault, David. We followed you. And what did it get us? Nothing but ashes and loss. But what does David do in this moment? Does he try to save himself from their stone-wielding hands by pointing in the direction of some enemy? Does he blame King Achish for making them go away from the city? Does he blame God for not protecting their families the same way he had protected the men? Does he play the victim, someone who had lost just as much as the rest of them? Does he start to point any and every direction to find someone else to blame, so that he could save face? No. With ash and tears still staining his face, David stands on the firm foundation of his God. He calls for the ephod, direct communication from Yahweh. Grab the Urim and the Thummim. We need direction now, not blame. The tracks of the raiders were obvious. They could be followed. But was that the wisest decision? Or was that the path to folly? Headlong into a trap of a vast host of enemies. That certainly wouldn't help anyone. But if God told him to go, David would follow these enemies. Smite them in the name of Yahweh, not in the name of David's vengeance. And the answer came. Yes, follow the tracks and you will not only overcome those enemies, but you will also certainly rescue those whom you have lost. There's double assurance in God's words here. Before we continue with David on this path, it's important for us to pause and take to mind the type of godly action that David does here. The action of a godly king that, yes, he's done before, but once again continues with God in it. There wasn't much else that David could have lost. Exiled from his nation, family taken, city burned to ash. Even his own men wanted him dead. All he had left to him were the things he physically carried himself. He couldn't get any lower, couldn't lose any more. This was another of those worst days of his life, one among so many now. But just like all of those other times, there was one last thing that David had not lost: his devotion to God. The God who, just 3 days ago, had used the Philistines to provide for his concerns. The God who time and time again had rescued David from enemies and disaster and death. The God who was faithful to his promises. The God we can turn to when sorrow is all that we have. When the darkness presses in on us, and all we feel that we can do is lay down and die. After our tears have run out, after our strength has left us, after every resource we could ever hope to find has turned to ash, we still have God with us. He will guide and direct. What makes a godly person worth following is the fact that they will turn to God even in the sorrowful times. Yes, weep and wail. Be concerned with the difficulties and the sorrows, but turn to Him for directions. I am definitely not saying that we just need to put on a smiley face mask to hide our distress. No, we don't hide the sorrow. With ash and tears still staining our faces, we can seek God's guidance. Guidance for what the next step is in the plan. Move in line with what God has for us, despite the sorrows weighing us down. Sorrow may drive us to our knees, but faith leads us to rise and take the next step. This is one of the things that separates David from Saul. When difficulties hit Saul, he blamed others and diverted attention away from him. Saul was nothing but a victim in all of his troubles. But David, as a godly example to follow, looked to God for strength to continue. He returned again and again to strengthen himself in Yahweh his God, as verse 6 would say. The flare of kingly action sparks in David's calling out to God for guidance. But listening to God is not the only action of a godly king. No, they will also patiently listen to the needs of others, even as they feel a sense of urgency to move. 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 9 to 20. So David set out and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 stayed behind who were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor. They found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David. And they gave him bread, and he ate. They gave him water to drink, and they gave him a piece of a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. And David said to him, "To whom do you belong, and where are you from?" He said, "I am a young man of Egypt, a servant of the Amalekite, and my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. We had made a raid against the Negev of the Kerethites, and against that which belongs to Judah, and against the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire." And David said to him, "Will you take me to this band?" And he said, "Swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this band." And when he had taken him down, behold, they were spread abroad over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing, because of all the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. And David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day. And not a man of them escaped except the 400 men who mounted camels and fled. David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had been taken. David brought back all. David also captured all the flocks and herds, and the people drove the livestock before him, and said, "This is David's spoil." With probably only a sense of immediate direction, David and his men chase after the raiders. The troops had considered their march to be near an end before, but now they have to hunt another army. And 6 straight days of marching will get to you, especially when your desire to hurry hits the steep incline of the far side of a valley where a brook runs during the rainy seasons. A third of David's men breathlessly peer up the incline and shake their heads. The spirit is more than willing to fight, but their bodies succumb to the incessant demands of marching. They just can't go on. David hears the needs of those men. They have to rest. They can't go on. And they would just slow down the rest of the men. So David decides, in wisdom, to leave the supplies with the men. He considers them the rear guard, those who will protect in case the enemy tries to take them from behind, even though David really has no clue where or when he will find the enemy. Not everyone has the same stamina that we have. Adrenaline can only take a person so far, and a godly leader will listen in wisdom and provide for those in need of a rest, even giving them a purpose in that rest. So the 400 men continue on, looking for any evidence of those who raided their city. Tracks get lost, false trails might have been followed for a bit, and probably right when they were starting to doubt God's favor again, they stumble upon an Egyptian in the middle of a field. This man was probably curled up in the most defensible position that a weak, hungry, and nearly dehydrated person could when a 400-man army descends upon him. But he was also provision offered by the invisible hand of God. David steps forward. Don't be afraid. Here's some food, some water. I have some questions, but they can wait until you're able to answer. But let's not move past the food given to the servant too quickly, especially the parts mentioned in verse 12. Do fig cakes and raisin clusters sound familiar to you? Something from an earlier passage of the book. They're the same thing offered by Abigail to David and his men when they were about to launch an attack against Nabal. The humble wisdom of offering a gift in order to receive blessing from the one offered the gift. The author had a reason to continually mention Abigail here in chapter 30. Only this time it was a gift from a king to a servant, instead of a maidservant to the anointed king. With the minutes flying by and armored men bouncing to get moving, the servant regains his strength through the gift. Then David asks who this man is and to whom he belongs. Nearly identical questions that Nabal had asked of David's men. Only this time the answers were listened to with wisdom instead of foolishness. The man declares that he had been a servant of an Amalekite. They'd been raiding the area, including burning down Ziklag. But because he had gotten sick 3 days ago, his master left him. Remember how I told you in the previous section to keep in mind the time frame of 3 days ago? Think about this. While David and his men had still been with the Philistines, God had the other Philistine kings and commanders send them home. And it took 3 days to get home. During that time frame, the Amalekites raided and burned Ziklag. But a servant of one of those raiders got sick. And now, 3 days later, David and his men find the same servant, one who is able to guide them directly to their quarry. Do you think that maybe the same God who used the enemies of his people to protect David's men might also have been the one to cause the sickness in this servant, so that David would have a breadcrumb to guide him to the men's families? Because the same 3 days that passed show God's guiding hand for David. On the same day that David was sent away from the Philistines, a sick man was abandoned by his master, also that David could have directions to his enemy. This is more than a coincidence. It's the hand of God guiding one who seeks after him. And it's used by that same godly king because he took a minute to listen in wisdom. What might have led to days and days of chasing became a direct line to the raiders, all because David listened to the God-given directions. The servant requested asylum for his actions, which David likely agreed to so quickly that the text doesn't even give it to us. It's like the story smash cuts to the servant leading David's men right to the drunken rager that the raiders threw, because they had taken so much stuff from the surrounding cities. Those men who had marched for a week straight descended upon the drunk partygoers from twilight until evening the next night. Hour upon hour of slaughter, just as they would have done to Nabal, if not for Abigail's intercession. But here, with the Amalekites, God blessed David's men with inhuman strength. These 400 men of David slew so many that the 400 young Amalekite men who escaped seemed to be a mere exception in the deaths of the enemy. Because David listened in wisdom, he was blessed by God, not only so that nothing was lost in all that was taken from Ziklag, but also in the fact that he gained the rest of the Amalekite spoils. A kingly reward for godly actions. And just like a king, the spoils were claimed by his warriors in his name. A king set home after a great victory. But that's not where David's kingly actions end in this story. No, we draw near to David's Avengers Assemble moment as he extends generous favor to others with the spoils of the king. 1 Samuel chapter 30, verses 21 to 31. Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow David, and who had been left at the brook Besor. And they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near to the people, he greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless fellows among the men who had gone with David said, "Because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoils that we have recovered, except that each man may lead away his wife and children and depart." But David said, "You shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. He has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is who goes into the battle, so shall his share be who stays with the baggage. They shall share alike." And he made it a statute and a rule for Israel from that day forward to this day. When David came to Ziklag, he sent part of the spoil to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, Here is a present for you from the spoils of the enemies of the Lord. It was for those in Bethel, in Ramoth of the Negev, in Jatir, in Aror, in Sifmoth, in Eshtemoa, in Rakal, in the cities of the Jerahmeelites, in the cities of the Kenites, in Hormah, in Borashan, in Athak, in Hebron, and in all the places where David and his men had roamed. On their way back, the 400 returned to the 200 who were still at the brook Besor. Their families were reunited as well, but as the celebration extended to those who remained behind, some among the 400 began to question whether these men should receive anything other than their families. David heard this ridiculous notion and spoke in kingly wisdom. Notice how he calls them brothers, but he also calls them mistaken. For who should listen to them and not share what God had blessed them with? It's not what you deserved, it's what God blessed you with, guys. Let us share God's blessing with others. It's not the strength of the warrior who fought the battle that provided the spoils. It is God who provided. And thus, David sets a law, like a king, that would remain a statute in the nation, a statute that says that those who stay with the supplies, as the rear guard, will receive equal spoils with those who actually did the fighting. Not only does a godly leader share God's grace equally among those following them, but they also speak in wisdom toward those who selfishly squabble over their share. David's generosity and God's provision doesn't end there either. No, he sends gifts to the cities of Judah around which David had roamed. The people who had blessed him while he was on the run from the king of Israel now are blessed by the man who soon will rule over them. He acts like a king, giving favor to those under his rule when he sends gifts to these cities. It's a political favor that leaders of nations do, not something that an exile does. Right here, we witness David acting like a real king, all because of God's blessings. We can learn a lot from David about being a godly leader in these verses, a godly person even. We should seek God, even in the sorrowful moments, instead of trying to find blame to lay on someone else. We should listen in wisdom despite the pressing in on us of time. And we should be generous with the blessings of God, because we didn't deserve the blessing. God provided it for us. All of these are things that point us to David as the hero. David's the one, like us, who must move forward in godly actions. And it would be easy for us to apply this passage by saying, if we just seek after God, not only will our losses be returned, but even more. But that wouldn't be true of all of us. God had a special position for David, plans of restoration that would flow through him. We're not David, and the path that God has for us might not lead to moments where people cheer in excitement. We might never have an Avengers Assemble moment. His path for us might remain in that sorrow for a long time, years, decades, maybe even most of our life. Does that mean that God has forgotten us, abandoned us? Have we failed him and missed out on our restoration? No. Whether we regain everything that was lost and more, like David did, or if we dwell in the loss of sorrow, in both directions and anywhere in between, the godly actions remain the same. When we're pressed in on every side, we should seek God, whether that leads to victory or remaining in the ashes of loss. When we don't know where to go, we should listen in wisdom, whether that leads us to the specific directions or whether that leads us to wandering for years. And when we receive the good things of God, we should generously share that grace with others, whether that be with vast riches or the 2 coins that we have to our name. God is actually the hero of this story, the one who provided a chance to regain what was lost, who gave directions, who blessed. It's easy for us to raise David as the hero because he's the protagonist of this story arc. But without God and his restorative plan, none of this would have happened. In each section of this chapter, and the previous chapter too, we witness the invisible hand of God guiding David. God directs and protects when all seems lost. To some he bestows grace through the plan that leads to nothing being lost and being given even more. But he also remains as the one thing that we cannot lose if we find ourselves in the ashes of this life that we thought was ours. It is because of God's presence, his loyalty to his covenant people, that we can perform the godly actions of those who follow him. Our role is to loyally turn to him in every situation, as he works his restorative plan through us. Whether in massive spoils of war or in the ashes, either way, turn to him, the one who provides, often through an invisible hand.